Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of the Church Planting Podcast. I'm Greg Nettle and I serve as president of Stadia Church Planting, where we help you start thriving, growing, multiplying churches for the next generation. Man, we have a special guest on this episode of the Church Planting Podcast, Mr. Marcus Bigelow, the first president of Stadia, on whom we stand on his shoulders and the shoulders of so many others. Marcus is passionate about church planting. He is a church planter himself. He loves church planters. He's helped more than 230 church planters multiply and grow their churches. Today, Marcus is passionate about the business intersection between business leaders and church planters. And he's going to be sharing how church planting has shifted and how multiplication can happen even more rapidly these days. Marcus Bigelow, we're excited to have you.
Well, I'm really excited to have my friend Marcus Bigelow with us right now. Marcus, so great to have you with us. Thanks for coming on.
Well, you're welcome, and brings back a lot of old memories.
Marcus, you are the founder, the first president of Stadia. New Church Strategies is the official name. Most people today know it by just Stadia Church Planting. And gosh, so we're celebrating our 20-year anniversary. And I learned so much from you in my early days of church planting. You remember what we were starting out in Ohio, and Stadia was so significant, and you personally, and coming in alongside of us and getting us going, and then my journey and following you and standing on your shoulders as president of Stadia. And we've only had two presidents. Marcus, let's go back. Let's go back 20 years ago, and let's just think about what was the kind of the water you were swimming in when you looked around. What was going on in the church planting world 20 years ago?
20 years ago, church planting was just starting to become, I think, a modern movement of God. If you were to say 30 years ago, I would tell you that church planting was almost dead. And I remember attending in 1996, a conference at Fuller. There was the National Church Planting Conference, and about 150 to 200 of us were there. And we represented probably the bulk of church planting leaders and church planters in the U.S. at that time. And like Rick Warren says, we don't create the wave, God creates the wave, and we've just had the chance to ride it. And suddenly things began to move in a positive direction. When I planted a church in '84, it was kind of like if you couldn't get a real job, you planted a church. It certainly wasn't. It certainly wasn't a preferred profession, and now it's become really an important thing to do. People see the importance of church planting, and I think that's so wonderful. I look at just even the attendance at Exponential. When I was starting, when Stadia was starting, we had a church planting conference that became Exponential that had 400 people, and it was the largest that they'd ever had. And now it's tens of thousands attend the Exponential Conference, and I think that just kind of summarizes in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and so I think that was known as the National New Church Conference, if I remember correctly, and I think that's where I first got introduced to Stadia and was at some of the Stadia celebrations and parties that you hosted and met you. Now, Marcus, 1984, you planted a church. Let's just talk about that. I know better from your leadership that you couldn't get another job. So, what was going on in your head? Why church planting?
I think it was a family business. My grandfather helped plant a church. My great uncle planted a church. My dad planted a couple of churches. My brother-in-law planted a church. My brother planted a church. And so it was kind of in our blood. And we've always had a heart for lost people. And that was, at that time, that was the best way to begin reaching lost people. And so I think that's kind of why I did it. I really believed that new churches were the best form of evangelism out there. And
so that's an unbelievable pedigree that I don't think I've met anyone else that has that kind of church planting lineage in their family. You said it was the best way to reach lost people back then. And we know today by every bit of data from the United States and around the globe that new church planting is the single most effective way of reaching people with the good news of Jesus Christ. So if anything, that's just been affirmed, confirmed, and even multiplied today. Now, so you're planting a church in 1984, but at some point you had to be thinking, okay, this isn't enough. We need to do more. How did that journey start?
Well, we never journey alone. And Dean Pence reached out to me and said, "Hey, Marcus, this is at the end of '95, and said, would you come and help me lead NCEA?" And at that point, I was on the process of buying a cemetery plot in Dublin, California, thinking I was going to die there, maybe sooner than later. But Dean Pence called me, and I go, "What do I have to offer?" And he believed in me way more than I believed in myself. And that's been the journey of being surrounded by my mentors and leaders who believed in me more than I believed in myself. And so I went to become his assistant director. 2 years from then, he kind of said, "The church that we're serving in has grown too big. I can't do both Stadia or NCEA and the church. Why don't you take NCEA and I'll be the pastor of the church?"
Okay, let me stop you there. NCEA, Northern California Evangelistic Association.
Yeah.
And what area were they serving, and were they planting churches at that time?
When I came, we were serving Northern California, which was everything from Fresno to the Oregon border. And we were planting about a church every 2 years. So about a half a church a year. And we were doing there was probably 30 church planting organizations across the country in the independent Christian churches that all were doing that or less. We were probably at the forefront. So God began to move. He brought some key donors in. In fact, some of the key donors are still Stadia supporters, and brought some of the right people. We moved from a church every other year to 2 churches a year, to 4 churches a year, to 6 churches a year. And at that point, Larry Winger and Doug Crozier from Church Development Fund came and said, "Mark, I was actually on the board of Church Development Fund, and it was the shortest chairmanship. I was chairman for 2 months, and then I became an employee." But we sat on the banks of the Columbia River up in Washington and began to dream what could happen if Church Development Fund and Northern California Evangelistic Association became partners, and what could possibly happen. They said, "We have a national audience. We think we could help spread that." And so we sat and dreamed, and we prayed, and we sketched on a napkin. And out of that came a vision to plant 5,500 churches by 2025. And I was just looking at the first newsletter that came out, and that was the stated goal, which when you're doing 6 churches a year, that sounded like an absolutely impossible God-sized dream. And yet he chose to make that happen.
I've got to stop there because so Northern California Evangelistic Association is looking at, so you're meeting with these great leaders, and this is just a God-birthed vision that we want to celebrate there. Do you happen to, what year approximately would have that been? Do you remember?
It would have been roughly 2002, 2001,
Okay.
2002, something like that.
Okay.
We decided that Northern California, if this was going to be a national organization, Northern California didn't belong in the name. And each, there was some resistance from other organizations around the country at first.
Yeah.
And then they began to say, hey, there's some momentum here. God's doing something. We immediately went from 6 to 10 churches a year and then 12 churches a year. And at the end of 10 years, we were planting 25 churches a year.
Yeah. Absolutely incredible growth for that time period.
And so people began to join with us. Louisiana, a couple of Texas associations, Colorado, Ohio. There was a number of began to say, hey, together we can do more than we can do separately. And I look at it and say that was a God thing.
Well, when I first got to know Stadia, it just you started to say together we can do more. I think the initial vision statement that I saw was together we will, and the idea of together we will plant more churches. We'll have more multiplication, which is a DNA that is still immersed in Stadia, in the idea of forming cohorts of churches and working with partners and bringing people together to create ecosystems. So I, for one, am grateful for that DNA that you imparted. And I don't want to leave this because I keep hearing Dean Pence's name. His name comes up in so many conversations, when we start talking about 20 years ago. Tell us a little bit about Dean, because a lot of his DNA was embedded in those early church planting days.
It is incredibly embedded in the whole process. Northern California Evangelistic Association was almost on its deathbed, and they called as kind of a last gasp Dean Pence to come down from Idaho in the successful church that he was pastoring there and lead this. And we had done, I think, 4 churches in the last 20 years, 3 of which had died. And Dean came down and said, let's start a church multiplication movement. And he said, not everybody's going to like it. And out of that came a statement that you've probably heard, let's go with the goers. And he basically said, we're not going to, people aren't going to like it, but we're not going to throw stones at them. We're just going to go ahead and move on with the ones that want to be part of the mission. And I can't, Dean was a quiet, he didn't like a lot of fanfare. He just kept moving and moving ahead with just a absolutely indomitable spirit that said, if God is in this, nothing can stop us. And he is, I would say, he is the one that really got NCEA and then ultimately Stadia moving in the right direction.
So it's funny, Marcus, you brought that up because that phrase is one you will still hear around Stadia today. I mean, okay, we're going to go with the goers, and then we say, and to the best of our ability, we're going to bless the rest, and that's been just such a great piece of wisdom and DNA that's been imparted into Stadia. So all those years ago, it's Northern California Evangelistic Association, and I don't know this story, but I'm guessing at some point said, hey, NCEA isn't probably the greatest branding name for a national and what would become a global organization. Where did the name come from? How did it come together?
That was almost a God thing as well. We had hired a branding company to help us figure out a name, and we had rejected 35 names that just didn't flow. And finally, one of them said, "How about Stadia?" It's the Greek word for a race. It's also in Revelation, it's the measure of heaven. Stadia was,
Yep.
Heaven was 12,000 stadia by 12,000 stadia. And I went to the meeting that day with the branding people ready to fire them. And this is what emerged. and it really caught our attention that, there's a race that we're running, and it's not always an easy race, and that heaven needs to be filled with people, and our job is to help fill heaven with believers. And that kind of became the backstory of the brand of Stadia.
You know, Marcus, I love that story, and I love the meaning behind Stadia. Stadia is also the root word from where we get the word stadium. And now I know out there in Northern Cal, you're not like probably a huge Ohio State Buckeyes fan, but you know, because I live here in Cleveland, I'm a diehard Buckeyes fan. And the Ohio State Stadium will actually seat little more than 100,000 people when it's completely full. And I wish I could take you there right now, so I'll just do it as a picture. But Marcus, if you could stand in the center of that stadium right now, I would love to do this for you and for Team Stadia and all the investors over the years. And you would fill that stadium with children under the age of 18. Stadia now, in our 20th year, has filled that stadium with children that have been reached with the good news of Jesus Christ and have had their life right now and their eternities transformed. And I just think it would be such a great visual for you to get to experience that, all those cheering children from that vision that you guys had on the bank of the Columbia River all those years ago. Now, when we start talking about adults, I mean, it would be filled multiple times over and over and over again. Now, and with people that have been reached as a result of that. And so Stadia was certainly the perfect name, for the organization that you were kind of birthing out there in California. So what were some of the challenges kind of as you were getting Stadia off the ground? I mean, there was opportunity, the wave was starting, but man, there were some challenges as well.
Yep, there always are in the middle of a God thing. The biggest challenge probably was that a lot of people didn't like us, that they were threatened. They felt like, the independent Christian churches, that word independent was really a big word for them, and it almost became cussed independence, that we don't cooperate with anybody. And so we picked up some serious flack along the way. We faced some legal challenges. CDF couldn't have us on their books as a part of them. So out of that came Provision Ministry Group. So there was some little bit of legal challenge. We went through, some personnel challenges like you always do. But the biggest one was people feeling threatened that we were going to somehow come in and disenfranchise them or whatever. And some of that was probably, as I look back, there's probably a little bit of, there was some ego on our part that said, we know how to do it better than you do. And, God forgive me for my egotism. I think in some ways it was a fact, but a fact with an ego attached is not a pleasant thing. So,
I appreciate your candor on that. And the independent Christian churches, the Restoration movement, just to kind of say that where it really has come full circle. Certainly, it's hard to imagine the investment over the years that those churches have made in Stadia and in church planting, and they are absolutely some of our biggest partners today and cheerleaders. And so however you navigated those early years, it has paid off. And I know there were mistakes made, and I appreciate your candor in that. And, from conversations you and I have made that I've made mistakes as well, that I've had to repent of and so forth. And it's all a learning process as we're trying to grow God's kingdom together. Let me come back now to in those early days. What were some? You're driving this forward. What were some of the opportunities that you saw that got you up in the morning and kept you going through those challenges?
I think we had some early wins. God brought us some wonderful church planters that planted some wonderful churches, and I think that was probably a piece of it. He brought some wonderful people to the team, like a Tom Jones and John Wassam, and some of your staff now, Doug Foltz and so on.
Yes.
Phil Claycomb, Roger Gibson. Yep. My philosophy of leadership has always been that I needed to define people who were better than me and help them play nice in the sandbox together. And God brought some people that shouldn't, by all means, I had no right to ask them to come and join us, and yet they got a hold of that vision and they joined us. And, the history of Stadia is the history of God bringing good people together to accomplish his mission, whether it's church planters, whether it's spouses of church planters. Let me also, while I'm thinking about the people, I'm thinking about Debbie Jones, who spent so much time caring for the wives of church planters, because that was a brand new piece of this. Along the way, some of the things that really, at that 2000 or that 1996 church planter conference at Fuller, Bob Logan and Steve Ogney said, there's three things that every church planting organization needs to do if they're going to do it. They need to do assessment, they need to do a boot camp, and they need to do coaching. And the coaching needs to be in systems and that kind of thing. So I came back and said, Dean, we got to have I was his associate at that time. I said, we got to have an assessment center. So we said, what would that look like? We don't have a clue. So we put together about a 3-page assessment process that we now laugh at, but it was the beginning, and it got fixed on the run. It was kind of the lean startup kind of a thing of minimum viable product, and then you just keep improving it. And God along the way brought us Roger Gibson, who turned our assessment center into a really good one. And one of the things that was a key piece was, at that time, all the church planting organizations only wanted to hire A players. You had to be a superstar to be a church planter. And Dean said, no, we're going to figure out how to help B and C players play like A players. Because if we provide them enough resources and systems and things in place, they can be stars. And they can shine, Daniel says, those who bring salvation to people shine like stars. And they did. And I think that was a key to the movement, I think, was that you didn't have to be a superstar to play.
Marcus, that's, so you talked about minimum viable product with the assessment center and how it started. And then when I became president, I would say that had moved, you had moved that to what I would call minimum lovable product, because, it was kind of the gold standard for years in church planting. And we just revamped it just 2 years ago. It's now called the Discovery Center. And the reason we revamped it was simply because we have so many different cultures now involved in the assessment center, so many different modalities of church planting involved, and so many different racial and ethnic backgrounds involved that we had to kind of overhaul it. But so many of those initial principles are still there, because you're exactly right. It's that first discovery of, am I called? How do I become an A player? Which is coaching, parts of cohorts, boot camp, all of those things, which Stadia has become known for. So all of those things continue at Stadia. They're modified, and as we continue to learn. And I just want to celebrate with you, because here in our 20th year anniversary this year, so 2023, I'm kind of smiling to myself, because the goal in that newsletter, which we that I read as well, the initial goal was 5,500 churches by the year 2025. Okay, so this year, 2023, Stadia is celebrating our 2,000th church plant, and that should happen in the first quarter of 2023. So, however, Stadia is getting ready, we believe, to break through to helping start multiple thousands of churches per year. And so by the end of this year, our goal is to move forward, planting a minimum of 1,000 churches per year. And the reason I was smiling is because I think it actually might happen. Yeah. Yeah. Go figure. Well,
and to put that in perspective, we were doing 6 churches a year when that vision came down, and it was just beyond what we could ask or think. And I look at church planters, And I think, if they don't have a vision from God, they're not going to make it. And if they do have a vision for God, even if it seems improbable, God can provide. And
Yes.
I remember Rick Stedman when we hired him as NCEA to come and start a church in Roseville.
Yep.
He had this vision. I almost voted not to hire him because I thought he was crazy. His vision was so big, and it actually outstripped even what he had hoped to have happen.
And then you've got, I think back of guys like Chris Delphs, Marcus, that I think was, one of the first church plants, whose church is absolutely a thriving megachurch today, and still a Stadia partner, and so many others like that.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's just been really exciting to see what God can do.
Well, Marcus, I've just got a few seconds in our time that we have together to wrap up. But, as you think about church planters today, and a lot of church planters and potential church planters and partners and leaders and investors are going to be watching and listening to this, what would you say to them from all of those years of church planting, your church planting legacy, my goodness, birthing Stadia and watching what Stadia has become today and being part of it? What would you say to all those people?
Wow. Listen to God's call on your life and be faithful to the call, even when those around you may not agree with the call. I don't take credit for anything that went on. It was a God thing. I just happened to be the tool that he put in place there. And there was lots of times when I would like to have given up. And I didn't. And God was faithful. And he'll see it through to completion. I guess that, the whole God is not finished with you. He'll see what you're doing and see it through to completion. I think that's the thing. So just one other comment I would make, and that is, having now worked in the business as mission and ministry arena for the past 11 years, I really think that there is something in church planting is finding out how to engage the business community. I've got 29 CEOs that I coach, or business owners and CEOs that I coach. We just did a little survey in December of how much influence do they have? They have influence on over 1.5 million people. Those 29 people. That's pretty good sized mega churches. In the Middle Ages, the Waldensians started a bunch of churches, and they sent 3 people out. They sent out a church planter, an evangelist. They also sent out a pastor who could take care of the people that the evangelist brought in, and they also sent a businessman with them, and partly for funding, but partly also, I think they had a sense that business guys know how to run things and how to get systems in place and how to make something sustainable. And I think if there could be a marriage between church planting and business, it would be incredible.
Marcus, I couldn't agree with you more. And, these days, the people that I learned so much from are businessmen, especially, and women who are followers of Jesus. Let's unpack this a little bit, because I know Pat and Linda Gelsinger were so instrumental in those early days, and I think that was a family relationship that you nurtured and then cast vision to for church planting. Tell us a little bit about that story, if you don't mind.
Well, it was a kind of a two-pronged kind of a thing. Pat was a member of a church that my brother pastored in San Jose, but Bryce Jessup was also his pastor, and I believe Bryce actually baptized them as a couple. And Bryce was the one that made the first formal introduction to Pat by email, and he said, Pat, you really need to get to know NCEA at the time. And Pat said, okay, I'm too busy to meet. Tell me a little bit about it by email. And he made his first 2 gifts to Northern California Evangelistic Association before we ever met face to face. That may be my bad. but I mean, frankly, I was a young punk at the time, and probably a little intimidated by this high-powered guy. But he became a dear friend, and he and Linda have been just pivotal in the church planting movement. We would not have made it had it not been for Pat and Linda Gelsinger, and had it not been for Church Development Fund, both of whom pumped significant resources in to allow us to make that jump to the next level.
That's so fun. So I want to jump on the back of that, because I just had a meeting with Church Development Fund, and it's years later now, and Church Development Fund is still a major partner with Stadia, and so excited about the future of church multiplication. And I am excited to say one of the things that I appreciate so deeply about you, Marcus, is you made this beautiful baton pass to me as the next president of Stadia with Pat and Linda Gelsinger, who now are dear friends of my wife, Julie, and I. Pat is the largest individual donor, investor with Stadia in church planting today. I meet with Pat once a quarter. He's the president and CEO of Intel now, and he's not that young punk anymore. He's now the major player on the global scene, and but I meet with him just to learn from him, like you said. Back to your point about businessmen and women speaking into the lives of church planting, and he's been so instrumental. So thank you for that relationship. But I couldn't agree and affirm more what you're saying about business leaders.
The future is bright.
Marcus, it is humbling to spend this time with you. And on behalf of literally probably nearly 1 million people around the world that know Jesus now as a result of your vision and that God gave you, I understand that. And all of those hundreds of thousands of children now. Team Stadia that exists today and those that have gone before, thank you. Thank you so much for being faithful through those years and through gutting it out and moving forward. And brother, I can't wait till we're in heaven together and you and I get to stand, side by side and with whoever the next president of Stadia will be. And thank God that we got to be part of this incredible adventure. Love you, man. And I know you're a very successful coach these days of leaders and high impact people and stuff, but so appreciate your faithfulness through the years. Thank you, Marcus.
Yeah, you're welcome.